Thank you, Chair. As you know, the money for the insane climate policy, for the pointless proxy war in Ukraine, for the mass migration that is disrupting our country, for the so-called voluntary buyout of our wonderful farmers, and for the further expansion of that terrible European Union that so subjugates and oppresses our country, has to come from somewhere. All these, in our view, foolish projects, which Forum for Democracy is the only party to oppose, cost us dearly. Tens of billions of euros per year, Chair. Tens of billions of euros year after year. And that money which disappears into the pockets of, among others, the climate lobby, the asylum sector, and the arms industry obviously has to come from somewhere. And that is why the Cabinet is going to make harsh cuts to social security and healthcare. The Dutch citizen is the one who suffers. For this Cabinet, the Dutch person comes last and must bleed and pay for the international ambitions of this Cabinet. That is to say, a globalist agenda, which in no way at all serves the Dutch interest. On the contrary, the Dutch are being ruthlessly bullied for this purpose and are expected to keep their mouths shut. Many Dutch people are now voting with their feet and have already emigrated or are planning to do so. The bill for the tens of billions that this Cabinet wants to spend each year on climate, asylum, and the arms industry will largely end up being paid by healthcare, which is what we are debating here today. No less than 10 billion euros are being cut from healthcare. For example, the personal contribution for them is going up, while from a democracy perspective it should actually be lowered. There will be a personal contribution for district nursing, and healthcare costs can no longer be deducted for tax purposes. 6 out of 10 people with chronic disabilities have indicated that they use this tax arrangement, and 40% of them expect to avoid care if this arrangement disappears. And I haven't even mentioned yet, Chair, the planned major cutbacks by this Cabinet on disability benefits, about which we have already received many distressing reports from all kinds of citizens who simply can no longer work and have nowhere else to turn. In addition, there are all sorts of ways in which cuts are being made to healthcare. For example, the National Healthcare Institute recently advised not to include a medication for Alzheimer's, which is simply reimbursed in other countries such as Japan and the United States, in the basic health insurance package. And this Cabinet is going to make access to non-contracted care even more difficult, with even longer waiting lists. As a result, why? And why, this is a question for the Prime Minister, if the Cabinet says it wants to focus on preventive care, is it forbidden for private providers in the Netherlands to offer broad preventive care, such as a colonoscopy or a body scan, without a referral? As a result, Dutch people have to go abroad, mainly to Germany, for this. And in this way, healthcare funds are also leaking abroad. Why is this Cabinet so eager to give the Dutch good withholding preventive care? Private care that does not put pressure on the healthcare budget and therefore does not cost the taxpayer a cent. Note, what is the thinking behind this? Or is that perhaps the intention, Mr. President, that the Dutch start mining healthcare? Because apparently, for this Cabinet, facilitating mass migration, stimulating the arms industry, and destroying our industry and prosperity for the sake of a so-called climate transition are more important than our public health. In fact, all of this can only be paid for if there are major cutbacks in healthcare. Those who need care have to make sacrifices. Those who need shelter get room service. That seems to be the motto of this Cabinet. Let's get to work. Indeed, Mr. Chairman, but not for the Dutch people. For this government, the Dutch come last. For us, for Forum for Democracy, on the other hand, only Dutch interests count. That is why we find it so troubling that this Cabinet does not choose for the Dutch and the Dutch interest, but instead pursues a globalist agenda and spends tens of billions on it. So, in summary, plenty of money is made available for others, that is, for mass migration, for a senseless proxy war in Ukraine, and for the disastrous European Union that is strangling our country, but no money for healthcare in the Netherlands. That is the story we are telling today. While last December, the Cabinet managed to free up no less than 700 million euros for Ukraine within 48 hours at the last minute on the current budget. There is no money to include dental care in the basic health insurance package, and 1 in 3 Dutch people with a low income avoids the dentist because of the costs. Some even never go to the dentist at all. Dutch people have to wait unnecessarily long at the pharmacy for their medication because there is only money to reimburse the preferred medicine, even if it happens to be sold out. Meanwhile, 19 billion euros can be allocated in no time at all. Extra funds are being made available for defense. That is to say, for the American arms industry. And that's where most of the money is going. Meanwhile, in healthcare, penny pinching is the rule of the day. Every cent is turned over 10 times, while the same cabinet, in the blink of an eye, can free up billions for Ukraine, the EU, or facilitating mass migration. That is the reality, Chairman. For this cabinet, it's not the Netherlands first, but rather that the Dutch are the last item on a budget that serves not Dutch interests, but a globalist agenda. And that's not all. While at the same time, when this cabinet cuts 10 billion, from healthcare, Chairman, more and more money is still going to the Ministry of Health itself. These so-called administrative costs, that is to say, the wage costs and other expenses of the civil servants working at the Ministry of Health, have risen dramatically in recent years. From just over 300 million euros in 2015 to more than 600 million euros in 2024. So, a doubling in 10 years' time. Meanwhile, the total costs for healthcare and welfare over this period have not doubled, but have increased by less than 70%, from 92 billion euros to 155 billion. How does the minister view this? And what is the minister specifically going to do to reduce the administrative costs of the Ministry of Health by at least a quarter? That is, from more than 600 million euros now to less than 500 million euros by the end of this decade. Finally, I would like to address two more topics, Chairperson. The first topic concerns youth care in general and forced out-of-home placements in particular. Especially regarding out-of-home placements, we continue to receive many alarming reports. What we keep hearing again and again, among other things, is that youth care and child protection are not interested in seeking the truth and supporting the family, but instead reasoning towards an out-of-home placement. And that the juvenile court judge then does not correct this, because the judge does not engage in fact-finding, but instead seems to blindly trust the judgment of youth care. In short, the entire system is failing. In addition, according to the parents and experts we have spoken to, there are perverse incentives at play in out-of-home placements and in not returning children to their families. This plays a role. For example, youth care gets paid when a child is placed out of home, but receives no money, in fact loses income share, once a child is returned to their own family. Question to the minister: is this correct? And is the minister willing to look for a funding model in which these perverse incentives play no role? For example, by giving youth care institutions a bonus when a child can be returned to their parental family, where they belong. And does it happen that foster parents can become financially dependent on the compensation they receive for their foster children? Or perhaps emotionally? Because we hear that as well, Chairperson. That foster parents who, however tragic and understandable, are themselves unable to have children, prefer not to give up the children they have in their care. And what is the minister's view on attachment theory, which is used by youth care, whereby after a certain period in the foster family, returning the child to the biological family is considered undesirable, because the child would then be too attached to the foster family? Is this the principle that youth care applies? Is this acceptable? Given that the policy should be that the child is returned to the original family as quickly as possible. And how is it possible, as research by Professor Bruning has shown, that only 19% of parents believe that youth care is doing its best to return children to their original families? This is a question for the minister. Is the minister, given all these alarming signals, willing to have research conducted into the experiences with youth care of parents whose children have been placed out of home and among the children themselves? So, who have ever, whether or not forcibly, been placed out of home? Forcibly been placed out of home? And what is the status of the implementation of our adopted motion to tighten the legal framework under which forced out-of-home placements can take place? So what is the status of that? Would it, that's a question, given all the abuses that have already come to light and which we have often debated here. For example, think of the fate of the foster girl from Vlaardingen and the fact that a forced out-of-home placement causes a lot of harm to the child and the family anyway. No one doubts that. It might be wise to include this as a requirement in this tightened legal framework, that the father and or mother must have been criminally convicted of child abuse before a forced out-of-home placement can be carried out. So, this is a question for the minister. Is the minister willing to at least investigate this option and report back to the House about it? Does the minister perhaps know in what percentage of forced out-of-home placements at this moment the mother and or father has been criminally convicted, or at the very least, I would expect, is being criminally prosecuted for child abuse? If this is not the case, would the minister be willing to investigate this and report back to the House? Finally, Chair, a few questions about a remarkable revelation last December in a podcast by De Nieuwe Wereld, in which Ruud Kornstra, who knows that both Diederik Gommers and Corona envoy Feike Sijbesma, Mr. Kornstra mentions, both gentlemen, mentioned by name, allegedly told him regarding a possible medicine for corona, which Mr. Kornstra, among others, discussed at the time with Prime Minister Rutte, that such a medicine would not be desirable because it would undermine the vaccination strategy and the pharmaceutical industry's business model. Chair, this is of course a very shocking revelation and, if true, extremely concerning. A Minister of Health who cares about public health should, after such a revelation, at the very least, make inquiries. With Mr. Kornstra, Gommers and Sijbesma, that goes without saying, it seems to me. However, the previous minister let us know when we asked about this that he did not consider it useful. He also refused, in violation of Article 68 of the Constitution, the letter from Mr. Kornstra to the Ministry of Health on this matter, as if one were to send the Ministry of Health's response to this letter to Parliament. Finally, my last question to this Minister Chair. Is she willing to do so? Thank you.